This week's Parsha is the Parsha of Terumah in terms of our consecutive readings of the Torah. And of course, it's the first of the Parshiot that deal with the Mishkan, its building, its utensils, and then, of course, Sefer Vayikra, and even into other places too, Bamidbar and Devarim, all of the ceremonies that are involved in the Mishkan. Also, of course, this week is prominently Parshat Zachor. It's a reminder of we are to remember what Amalek did to us. Of course, we do remember. I'm not going to focus on that right now. There's a number of things that we will talk about, but just simply, I say often that when the Torah tells us, Zachor et asher asa lecha Amalek, that we as Jews are obligated to remember what Amalek did to us, usually we don't have to be reminded when someone does something very wrong to us, exceptionally wrong. We don't have to be reminded about what they did. But of course, here there's a special mitzvah of Mechiat Amalek, to eradicate Amalek. But I think there's another element to this that we sometimes overlook, and that is that we can tend to overlook that there is Amalek, I think, in each person, at least figuratively, if not literally. For example, the Chazal tell us that when the snake, at the time of the Gan Eden, when the snake, the Nachash, did what he did, he gained nothing from it. And that's similar to Lashon Hara, etc. Amalek also really gained very little from what went on. And I think we have to realize to some degree that we have to remember not only what Amalek did to us, but the Amalek, the vestige of Amalek that sometimes resides within us. When we do cruel things, when we speak ill of another person, not for toilet, not for any beneficial purpose, but just simply l'shem lashon hara. He gained nothing from it, but that is a part of us. I remember a number of, don't have to look back to a number of years ago, but I'm going to tell you this quick story about Amalek, then we're going to move on. There is a story of, unfortunately, in the time of the first Intifada, that there were some rock throwers in the Galil. They threw rocks. They hit a car with a young mother with her child there, and she lost control of the car, and the car tumbled over the cliff, and she was killed along with the child. A terrible, terrible situation. Some days later, maybe even some weeks later, of course, the anger was very great. We weren't even used to it. At that time, first Intifada, we weren't used to such behavior. Unfortunately, we got used to it. But a number of Jews attacked two Arab boys, I believe it was. Young boys, not 6 or 7, but teenagers. They attacked them, and they wanted to bury them alive. Along came other Jews, and they literally dispersed the mob, and thus protected these potential victims of the mob. So then, at that point, I determined that we all have both Avram Avinu in us, a tremendous capacity to do kindness and chesed and good. We also have the capacity to do bad. Our job is to make sure the Avram Avinu, which is in us, overrides the Amalek. That's a very important thing. We have to realize, again, Baruch Hashem, we are a wonderful nation. We are a good nation. But as you know, just several years ago, 2 or 3 scoundrels burnt down an Arab house, killing the inhabitants, a family, father, a mother, and a child, that's Amalek. That's now I don't know whether it's genetically Amalek, but that's Amalek. There was nothing to be gained from that. And we must remember when we must remember what Amalek did to us, and therefore not ever to allow it in our midst as well. So that's my little speech on Amalek, and there are various different ways in our COVID reality that we can be Mekayim the mitzvah of Schirat Amalek. It's not for me to paskin, but it can, according to some poskim, it certainly can be done even without a minyan, preferably with a minyan. And if possible, it should be read from a chumash and with the trup. But please ask your respective rabbanim as to how one can fulfill it if one is not in the shul. Now let's turn to something which is, I think, more uplifting for us than talking about Amalek, even though we have to. I'd like you to turn to Perek Kaf Hey in Shmot, Parshat Terumah. The Torah, Perek Kaf Hey, Pasuk Kaf Aleph, the Torah prior to this gives us instructions as to how to build the Aron Kodesh, how it's to be built, its length, its width, materials that are be a part of it, the wood in the middle and gold on the outside and the inside. And each of these is filled with symbolism. But we're going to turn now right after that, right after Sheni. We're going to turn right after Sheni. I really a little bit earlier than I said before. Perek Kaf Hey Pasuk Yud Zayin. After the Aron is built and the Edut, the tablets are placed in it, or will be placed in it at some point, the Torah tells us, V'asita chaporet zahav tahor. You are to make something which is called kaporet. The Torah seems to assume that we know what kaporet is. Amatayim v'chetzi orka, it has to be two amot and a half in length, the amma v'chetzi rochban, and amma and a half in width. In other words, it's to fit on top of the Aron Kodesh. Those are the dimensions of the Aron Kodesh, at least the surface dimensions. V'asita shnaim kruvim. You are to make two keruvim. Now the keruvim are right now what we would call baby-faced angels, so to speak. Zahav, they are to be made of gold, but here's the key. Miksha ta'aseh otam. They have to be made out of one, both the kaporet itself and the kruvim, which are to extend from either end, are to be made from one block of gold, pure gold. Miksha ta'aseh otam mishnei kitzot kaporet. In other words, actually, the Gemara tells us that if you made the kaporet and then you put the kruvim on it artificially, it's puzzled, cannot be used. The whole idea is out of one block of gold, the kaporet, the covering for the aron, was to be made. And then the Torah tells us va'asei kruv echad mikatsa mizeh ukruv echad mikatsa mizeh. The kruv is to be formed from that block on either side of the kaporet. Ta'asu et hakruvim, you shall make these kruvim al shnei kitzotav. Then the Torah tells us, va'ayu hakeruvim porsei kanafayim lamala. These keruvim, the image of children, are to span their wings upward. So chachim b'chanfehen, covering with those wings the kaporet, whatever the kaporet is or its purpose. That's what we're going to talk about. Ufnehem ish el achiv, and their faces, the faces of the two kruvim, are to be facing each other, ela kaporet, and also somewhat downward toward the kaporet. We'll talk about that in a moment or a few moments. Yiyu pnei akruvim. That's the way, and they should be facing each other. So they face each other in a downward cast. but they are facing each other. That is what the Kruvim did. Now we have two questions. Question number one is, what is the kaporet, and what is its source? What is the meaning of the word kaporet? Well, we know that in Hebrew the term kafor or kaper, as in Yom Kippur, means it's a borrowed term, means to be forgiven, atoned. Yom HaKippurim. So the word Kippur and Kaporet are very closely etymologically connected. Now, so we know that, but what does it mean? We know it's tied to some sort of forgiveness, but what does the word Kafor mean? We find, for example, the same shoresh as Rav Hirsch mentions, Kaf Pei Resh, with the word Kofer in the time of Noach. He was to plaster the pitch over the teva as a sealant, a cover, a protection of some sort. So we see that the word kafor has to do with protection, sealant. Also, people see it as meaning to clean, to cleanse, kafor. So the word kaporet then is tied not only to the physical form of sealant or cover, but it also deals with our spirituality as well. Yom Kippur, lechaper al bnei Yisrael, to attain a certain degree of forgiveness for the Jewish people. That's what we have. Now, the Gemara in Baba Batra explains something very interesting. Some of you, if not all of you, may have heard this. Okay, we know that there is the Kruvim are mentioned not only here, but they're also mentioned in the time of Shlomo HaMelech, when he built the Beit HaMikdash. He also used Kruvim, but it's interesting. The Kruvim that are here are said they face each other. But then the Gemara says, Uvemikdash Shlomo, in the Beit HaMikdash of Shlomo, this is recorded in Divrei HaYamim, Omer Ufnehem Labayit. Their faces were toward the walls, apparently, or certainly toward whatever the room was in which they were in. So what does that mean? The Gemara Baba Batra says, HaKetzad, how is this possible? Kan bizman sheYisrael osin ritzono shel makom. When the Kruvim face each other, that's at a time when Jews are doing osin ritzonam shel makom, when they are doing the will of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, whether it is through the observance of the mitzvah of bein adam lachavero, bein adam lamakom, that's what God's will is. So they face each other. Kan bizman she'ein Yisrael osin ritzono shel makom. But in the time of Shlomo, the Jews were not always so cognizant of the welfare of their friends, and therefore they actually were turned away. Now, it's a very beautiful medrash, of course, and it's in itself, the Gemara itself is instructive for us. I was thinking also that it's important to try to find answers that are not mutually exclusive. So I think another interpretation, an additional interpretation, not in place of, is that when are Jews not doing the will of God? When they're not facing each other. And when they're not facing each other, meaning to say, when they don't see each other as Re'im Ahuvim, people, a Jewish people who love each other, literally, when we're in a situation like that, that's Einam Osim Ritzono Shel Makom. But when our faces are to our brothers and sisters, whether or not they observe exactly the same way we do, of course we want people to all observe Torah and mitzvah. But if we don't worry about the Jewish people, then no one for sure is going to worry about the Jewish people. So I would say then there's two interpretations. One is when the Jews do the will of God, so then they actually miraculously turn toward each other. And when they don't do the will of God, they turn away from each other. And the other possibility is that, in fact, when we turn away from each other, that's not the will of God. When we turn toward each other with chesed, and we know one of the things that we can take tremendous pride in, I believe, is the tremendous chesed that exists in this community and in so many Jewish communities, wherever they are, the Hasidic communities. I remember in Eretz once, I was in Eretz Israel, and my job was usually to go get challah in the morning, Friday morning, to go get challah. So for whatever reason, I thought that they had their own challah. We're ready to sit down at the table Friday night, and my daughter asks respectfully, "Where's the challah?" And I said, she asked me, "Did you get it?" I said, "No, I didn't get it." So naturally, I was very, very upset with myself. And she said, "No problem." She sent out one of the children. They have a challah gamach. In case there are more idiots than just me, there might be others out there. So they have a challah gamach, which supplies it. Of course, they ask you to pay back. That's how you can keep it supplied. But even down to challah, not to mention Yad Sarah, not to mention the wonderful chesed fund that we have here, and all of the things that we have, we are a people of chesed. And in that sense, the keruvim are looking at each other. Now, so Chazal tell us they're baby-faced angels, so to speak. I want to share with you something from Tehillim, Perek Chet in Tehillim. It has within it a number of famous phrases, but it begins, Hashem Adonenu ma'adir shimcha b'chol haaretz. Hashem, how magnificent is your name and your reputation throughout the world. Asher tenahodcha al hashamayim, that you, in fact, your majesty extends even beyond the heavens. But this is the pasuk we're going to read. Mipi olalim v'yonikim yisadta oz. Okay, yisadta oz. From the mouths of children, you have established strength. As a matter of fact, from this, I'm certain we get the phrase from the mouths of babes. When you hear a child say something very precociously, you will hear a person say somewhere, from the mouths of babes, such comes out. A certain Chazal tell us that nevuah comes. We're going to see that as well. But the idea is olim v'yonkim. Olim are maybe toddlers. Yonkim are children who are still nursing. God has established, Yisad Ta'oz, God has established his strength through them. Now, Rabbeinu Ibn Ezra, who lived a little bit after Rashi, and he might have been alive a little bit when Rashi, their lives may have intertwined a bit, but he was known as the greatest Tanakh scholar of his time, at least in certain sections of Klal Yisrael. He writes the following: Hanachon be'enai. It appears correct to me, ba'avur hayot adam nichbad mikol nivra'ei mata, because human beings, are the most majestic, the most honored of all of the lower creations, meaning to say, the animal kingdom, everything, all organic life. We are the most chosen and honored. Amar Cain, he said this. Now listen carefully to this. Ki me'et sheyachel hanar ledaber, from the moment that a child begins to formulate speech. V'zeh tam mipi olalim. This is what it means when it says about a child, olalim, a toddler. Most of the young children begin to speak at when they begin to walk, etc. And they say one words or two words. They try to formulate them. Okay. So what does he say? Az, at that moment, tachel matkunto lekabel koach haneshama. That is the moment when the neshama enters the child, begins to enter. Apparently, Rabbeinu Ibn Ezra believes that the entrance of the neshama is a process, not an event. It's a process. When a child begins to think and talk, that's why I wanted to hear the word. I wanted them to hear the word. To hear the Torah's way of expressing the most sublime of human activities, whether it's love or other things, so that as their neshama enters into them, they would grow. Their neshama would grow as they physically grew, and that's what he says. That the nefesh, the neshama, takes hold. Right, the neshama takes hold within the child that gets older, and when we talk about we talk about the different levels of creations in the world. So there is domain and chaim and those which grow, and then you have the medaber, the person. We are people of speech. Speech does not mean that we can formulate words like I just didn't, but it doesn't mean that. It means that we are capable as human beings to be able to conceptualize a sublime idea and a sublime thought, and we are able then to put it into a message so that others will understand what we're doing. So that's why one of the reasons that these children in the Mishkan, the children who were the Kruvim, they face each other. They need to communicate with each other, and it begins when they're children. Now, we're going to see a passage from the Lutzkerov, who was Reb Zalman Sorotskin. Some of you might have been in Yerushalayim and you heard this. You know the street Sorotskin. Well, Sorotskin, that street was named after him, and he was a very prominent figure in Europe, even after the war, I believe. Yeah, after the war, he wrote a sefer called Oznaim LaTorah. Strange word, right? The ears of the Torah. Well, actually, it's taken from a Gemara. The Gemara says the Torah Shebal Peh is the Oznaim LaTorah, is the handle. Oznaim, if you have like a saucer or a cup, or you have something that you want to lift up, so it had, they call these Oznaim because they look like ears. So it's Oznaim LaTorah. So that's the Torah Shebal Peh, the oral law, according to Chazal, but it also includes he says, he calls his sefer Oznaim LaTorah, that hopefully he'll help us to take hold of the Torah from it. And here's what he says. The Kruvim were like young children, like very young children, to teach us about the education of children. So he says that it should be established, and that they should not engage unnecessarily in other chokhmas, other forms of wisdom. To him, of course, and he lived, the life of a very pious Eastern European Jew. There's no need to go into philosophy, and there's no need to go into history, into these other things, but rather they should learn Torah as much as possible. And apparently, he was opposed to the idea that they would study their general studies most of the day. The religious studies. So he said, no, the primary focus of their life needs to be the Torah studies. That's what he held. And he said they become, now that we're living in a time where there's no nevuah, there is no prophecy, that prophecy has been transferred to children in so many different ways, not necessarily the prophecy of Isaiah, but the prophecy that comes through the purity of heart and through innocence. And that, of course, is what the Kruvim were meant to represent. And so that's what he says. That's what it should be. And I want to share with you what Shamshon Raphael Hirsch says about the kaporet and the kruvim, the relationship between this slab of gold, which from it emerged or was made to emerge the kruvim. It doesn't say that it was done miraculously, not at all. It was done by the craftsmen, by Bezalel and by his crew of craftsmen. So I think we should take note of that. It was they were to do this, and you obviously would have to be quite good at what you're doing. Rav Hirsch says, now the cherubim are not described as being direct guardians or protectors of the tablets. Okay, you have the tablets, then you have the kaporet, and emerging from as one piece from the kaporet are these cherubim. So he says the cherubim or the keruvim were not the direct guardians or protectors of the tablets themselves, because they were inside the ark, and the ark was covered with the kaporet. But it says that their wings were to span over the kaporet, and they should face each other. Both mental concentrations, he says, and their actual material protection are directed to the kaporet. They really are not protecting directly the Torah, he says, but they're direct. They are protecting the kaporet. So the question you have to ask is why? He says, on the other hand, as cherubim are nothing separate from the kaporet. Listen carefully. He was, by the way, Rav Hirsch wrote numerous books on symbolism. He was a philosopher, and in addition to many other things, but he wrote books on symbolism, and he takes note. He says the cherubim are nothing separate from the kaporet, but are a part of the cover itself. That's right. That was essential. After it has been completed, the actual protection of the tablets from both sides rises up itself and becomes its own cherubim. In other words, the protector becomes the cherubim, who are the protectors of the kaporet. That's how he sees it. And he says, what's the lesson for us? He says, by guarding and taking care of God's Torah, one becomes a cherub for oneself. When we protect the Torah, when we give to Torah organizations, when we not necessarily monetarily, but every time we go to a minyan that we're not sure is going to be because of a snowstorm or because of any number of other things that can disrupt Jewish life. So he says, when a person guards the Torah, he in effect becomes a cherub and he guards himself. The protection one gives to God's Torah becomes one's own protection. It's remarkable. The more we work to protect and to grow the Torah itself, that's the more we ourselves are protected. And at the same time makes one become a bearer of the glory of God on earth. With every effort Israel makes to carry out and protect God's Torah, it achieves only its own preservation and furthers its own well-being and happiness. So that says Rav Hirsch, is the message of the Keruvim and the unit of Keruvim and Kaporet. It wasn't just that God had an idea. Well, let's see if these guys can do that. Can they really make two cherubim out of a lump of gold? No, that's not the point. The point is that certainly the Kaporet, by being over the Aron, protected God's Torah, and the Keruvim were symbolically protecting the kaporet, which protects the luchot. That is the issue that we have. And forever, throughout Jewish history, our children have been the symbol of our success. I want to share two quick stories with you about Eretz Yisrael. First story is the first time I was in Eretz Yisrael, I was completely enchanted by bus drivers. Not everybody is enchanted by bus drivers, especially if you're driving. But I just saw them. And especially the bus drivers that were driving through the neighborhoods like Mea Sharim, like the Ula, the intensely Haredi neighborhoods where very little, if any, general studies was taken. And you had one of the drivers of the bus would stop because I for some reason I had to go through that area several times, probably looking for trinkets to bring back. So I'm sitting in the bus, and oftentimes I'd see the same bus driver. And when the children got on with their payas and everything else, here he is. He's got a picture of Lubavitcher Rebbe on the bus, but he doesn't have a kippah on. He turns to the child, and he says to the child, he actually strokes the child's chin and cheek and says, "Was hat dir gelernt heint? What did you learn today?" This is what it means to be in a Jewish society. We need to get over the fact that maybe he himself was not that dati yet, but to him, Jewish children were precious, and he knew and understood they are the future of any people, and most certainly the future of Klal Yisrael. So he would say, "Was hat dir gelernt heint?" And he would call him Motek. Yeah, "Was hat dir gelernt heint?" Motek. Motek means sweetheart. Okay. And the child would tell him, pasuk he learned this or that. The child knew to expect it from him. The second element was about child raising. I was sitting on a bus. This was much later, several years after our first trip. And it was a very crowded bus. And there was a man, a Sephardi man, obviously I say Sephardi only to show his magnificence, Sephardi man with his son Moshe. So an elderly person got on the bus and had nowhere to sit. And he wasn't even looking so much where to sit. And so the father says, "Moshe, kum, get up." So Moshe starts to get up, and the man says, "Lo, pishev, sit down." And then he said, "Adoni." He didn't say Adoni. He said, "Moshe, kum." So Moshe gets up. Must not have been an easy trip for him. He gets up, and he says, "No, pishev." So this happened maybe one more time. And when it happened the third time, the father turned to the elderly man and said to him, "Adoni." He said, it's katuv, and as only a Sephardi could say it, katuv b'torat Moshe Rabbeinu. It's written in the Torah of Moshe Rabbeinu, mipnei seva takum. When an elderly person enters the room, seva really means white hair, but elderly person enters the room, you stand. He said, "I don't mean to call you old," he said, "but I must train him to do mitzvot." So the boy got up and the man sat down. But this is what it means. When we're living in an age where there are no families, where the fathers aren't in the homes, and it doesn't matter what, they can be rich and poor. It's just nothing. The family is dissolved. This man was made sure that Moshe understood his obligations toward his fellow man, toward the elderly, the prior generation. And God willing, I have a feeling Moshe right now is probably telling his son to stand up when somebody enters the buses. All right, everybody, I want to wish everyone a Shabbat Shalom. Mi'at Hashem, we'll meet next week. And thank you for joining. Great. Call to
Thank you.
Thank you.
It was wonderful.
Thank you.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
It was wonderful.
you.
Yes, you taught.
And